The jungle was alive with shadows, but for the first time in warfare history, American soldiers could see them all. What the Vietnamese called the American ghost shooters emerged silently from the darkness, their eyes glowing with an eerie green light that transformed night into day. These weren't supernatural beings. They were U.S. soldiers equipped with the ANPVS-2 Starlight Scope, a revolutionary night vision device that would forever change the nature of warfare and strike terror into the hearts of Vietnamese soldiers who had long dominated the night battlefield. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. For centuries, the night had been warfare's great equalizer. Darkness provided cover for movement, rest, and resupply. Throughout military history, armies adjusted to this natural rhythm, fighting by day, recovering by night. The Vietnam War initially followed this ancient pattern. North Vietnamese Army, NVA troops, and Viet Cong guerrillas exploited this limitation brilliantly, moving supplies along the Ho Chi Minh Trail under cover of darkness and launching surprise attacks at night, when American technological superiority in air power, artillery, and communications was partially neutralized. Lieutenant James Rayburn recalled the early days of the conflict. "We owned the day, but Charlie owned the night. That was the unwritten rule of the war until 1967. We'd set up defensive positions before sunset, establish overlapping fields of fire, and pray we wouldn't be overrun before morning. We could hear them moving out there in the darkness, sometimes just a few feet away, but unless they fired, we couldn't see them. It was psychological torture, knowing they could see us better than we could see them." In the Pentagon, military planners recognized this critical vulnerability. The night battlefield had become the Achilles heel of American military operations in Vietnam. General William Westmoreland, commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam from 1964 to 1968, noted in his memoirs, "The enemy's near-total ownership of the hours of darkness severely restricted our operational capabilities and provided them with their primary tactical advantage. This disadvantage was not merely tactical, but also psychological. American troops felt vulnerable and exposed, while Vietnamese forces moved with confidence through terrain they knew intimately. The solution lay in a technology that had been developing slowly since World War II. Night vision devices had their genesis in rudimentary infrared sniper scopes used in limited numbers during the last days of the Pacific Campaign. These early devices required bulky infrared illuminators, essentially invisible searchlights, that gave away the position of the user and drained batteries quickly. They were awkward, unreliable, and saw limited deployment. But the concept, the ability to see in darkness, held tremendous potential. The breakthrough came with passive night vision, technology that amplified existing ambient light from stars, the moon, and other natural sources rather than projecting its own illumination. This development occurred at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, where the U.S. Army's Night Vision Laboratory had been established in 1954. Engineers and scientists worked tirelessly to develop what would become known as Starlight technology, image intensification that could amplify available light up to 1,000 times. By early 1965, the first prototype of the ANPVS-2 Starlight Scope was ready for field testing. Weighing approximately 6 pounds, the scope resembled an oversized telescopic sight that could be mounted on rifles or used as a handheld observation device. Inside its metal housing was revolutionary technology, a series of electronic components that captured photons, light particles, converted them to electrons, multiplied them, and then converted them back to visible light on a phosphor screen that produced the characteristic green image. The green coloration wasn't an aesthetic choice, but a practical one. The human eye can distinguish more shades of green than any other color, making it ideal for detecting subtle differences in low-light environments. The first units arrived in Vietnam in late 1966, with full deployment beginning in early 1967. Initially, the scopes were issued to select sniper teams and reconnaissance units. Captain Michael Thornton, who commanded a reconnaissance platoon in the Central Highlands, remembered the first time he saw the technology demonstrated. We were taken to a completely darkened room, couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Then they told us to look through these scopes. Suddenly, you could see everything, people moving around, equipment on tables, writing on a blackboard. It was like switching on a light. We all had the same thought. This is going to change everything. And change everything it did. The introduction of night vision technology in Vietnam represented one of the most significant tactical innovations of the war. For Vietnamese forces who had relied on darkness as protection, the impact was immediate and psychologically devastating. Major Nguyen Van Coy of the North Vietnamese Army later wrote in his memoirs, "We first encountered this technology near Dak To in 1967. Suddenly, our night movements were being detected with alarming accuracy. Patrols that had moved safely for months were being ambushed. Supply missions were intercepted. We initially believed American forces had developed a new type of radar. It was weeks before we captured a scope and understood what we were facing. The Starlight scope transformed night operations for American forces. Defensive perimeters could now detect approaching enemy forces at distances up to 400 meters. Ambush teams could identify and engage targets that previously would have passed undetected. Snipers especially found their effectiveness multiplied. Before night vision, snipers were largely daylight operators. Now they could continue their deadly work around the clock. Sergeant Carlos Hathcock, perhaps the most famous American sniper of the Vietnam War, with 93 confirmed kills, described the difference. Before the Starlight, night missions were about listening, not seeing. You'd hear movement and fire in that general direction, hoping to hit something. With the scope, I could see a man walking through the jungle at 200 yards on a moonless night. I could see his weapon, his equipment, even tell if he was NVA or Viet Cong by his uniform. It took away their greatest advantage. The psychological impact on Vietnamese forces was profound. As word spread about the American ghost shooters who could see in the dark, many Vietnamese soldiers developed a superstitious fear of night operations. Intelligence reports and captured documents revealed that some units refused to move at night, believing Americans had supernatural powers. A Viet Cong defector told interrogators, "We were told the Americans had magic eyes." Men would be walking silently through the jungle and suddenly fall dead without even the sound of a gunshot. We began to believe they could see our souls in the darkness. This superstitious reaction wasn't entirely unfounded. The most elite American snipers using the Starlight scope also employed sound suppressors, silencers, on their rifles. The combination created a truly ghost-like experience for the Vietnamese. Silent death from invisible attackers in the darkness. A psychological operations officer reported that some captured documents referred to certain jungle areas as haunted by American spirits that should be avoided after sunset. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong proved remarkably adaptable, however. Within months of encountering the new technology, they began developing countermeasures. They correctly deduced that the devices amplified existing light, rather than seeing heat signatures, which would come with later thermal imaging technology. This led to tactical adaptations, moving on exceptionally dark, moonless nights, traveling under thick canopy, using smoke to obscure vision, and avoiding open areas after dark. Lieutenant Colonel Tran Van Nuit, a North Vietnamese tactical advisor, documented these adaptations. "We learned to use weather to our advantage. Heavy rain reduced the effectiveness of these devices. Fog confused them. We taught our soldiers to move in single file, staying under the densest vegetation. When possible, we conducted operations during the darkest phases of the moon cycle. We adapted because we had to. The alternative was annihilation." Another adaptation was the targeting of American troops known to carry night vision equipment. Snipers and nighttime observation posts became priority targets for Vietnamese forces. The telltale green glow visible from the eyepiece of an active starlight scope, though faint, could give away the position of the user to a vigilant observer. Several American snipers were targeted specifically because Vietnamese forces had identified them as night vision operators. Staff Sergeant James Gordon, a sniper with the 9th Infantry Division operating in the Mekong Delta, described one such incident. "I was setting up a night position when a single shot cracked past my head. It was aimed precisely at where I'd been holding the scope a second earlier. They'd seen that green glow and targeted it. After that, we learned to use the scope intermittently, not continuously, and to shield the eyepiece with our hand when scanning." Every technological advantage comes with a counter. Despite these countermeasures, night vision technology fundamentally altered the balance of power in the night battlefield. Statistics told the story. Before widespread deployment of the starlight scope, approximately 70% of American casualties occurred during nighttime operations. By late 1967, that figure had dropped to below 50%. Meanwhile, Vietnamese forces found their night movement capabilities severely restricted, forcing them to carry supplies and conduct troop movements during daylight hours where they were vulnerable to American air power. The impact extended beyond direct combat applications. The technology allowed for more effective night ambushes along infiltration routes, particularly the network of jungle pathways, collectively known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Special reconnaissance teams, often operating deep in enemy territory, used the scopes to gather intelligence on troop movements that would have been impossible to detect otherwise. Staff Sergeant Barry Sadler, who served with a long-range reconnaissance patrol (LRRP) team, explained, "Before starlight, we were essentially blind at night unless we used starlight scopes or illumination, both of which compromised our position. With night vision, we could observe enemy movements without detection. We'd set up along known trails and count troops, identify weapon types, note supply loads, all while remaining completely hidden. That intelligence saved countless lives and allowed for precisely targeted operations." The technology was not without limitations, however. The first-generation starlight scopes required at least some ambient light to function effectively. On completely overcast nights with heavy cloud cover blocking starlight, their effectiveness was significantly reduced. They were also sensitive to sudden bright lights. A muzzle flash or illumination round could temporarily blind the device and leave the operator vulnerable for several seconds until the scope readjusted. Physical limitations also posed challenges. The early units were bulky, adding significant weight to a soldier's already heavy load. Battery life was limited to about 4 or 5 hours of continuous use, requiring operators to carry spare batteries for extended operations. And the technology was extraordinarily expensive. Each starlight scope cost approximately $2,000 in 1967, equivalent to over $16,000 today, meaning they could only be issued to specialized units rather than becoming standard equipment for all frontline troops. Technical Sergeant William Eastman, responsible for maintaining night vision equipment for a Special Forces unit, highlighted another challenge. These were sensitive optical instruments being used in one of the harshest environments on Earth. The humidity in Vietnam was a constant enemy. Fungus would grow on the lenses if they weren't cleaned daily. The electronics would short out if water got inside the housing. We had dedicated maintenance schedules just for the night vision gear and still lost about 1 in 5 scopes to environmental damage alone. Despite these limitations, the technology proved so effective that production and deployment accelerated throughout 1967 and 1968. By 1969, most American combat units had at least some night vision capability, with specialized units like sniper teams, reconnaissance patrols, and ambush teams receiving priority allocation. The technology was also adapted for vehicle-mounted applications, with larger night vision systems installed on tanks, armored personnel carriers, and helicopter gunships. The UH-1 Huey helicopters, iconic symbols of the Vietnam War, were among the first aircraft to receive night vision upgrades. Pilot Captain Robert Mason described the transformation. Flying at night had always been one of the most dangerous things we did in Vietnam. We relied on flares for illumination, which made us perfect targets. When we got the night vision systems, suddenly we could fly without external lights, navigate by terrain features we could actually see, and identify targets on the ground. It was like having a superpower. We started running night medevac missions that would have been suicide previously. The psychological effect on American troops was as profound as the tactical advantage. Soldiers who had previously dreaded the setting sun now volunteered for night operations. The knowledge that they could see when their enemy could not provided an immeasurable boost to morale. Private First Class Michael Jenkins expressed this sentiment in a letter home. "For the first time since I've been in this country, I feel like we have the upper hand. Before, night was something to fear. Now, we own the darkness. You can sleep better knowing the night belongs to us now." By 1969, night vision technology had evolved beyond the original Starlight scope. Second-generation devices began appearing in limited numbers, featuring improved resolution, better low-light performance, and reduced weight. More significantly, the technology expanded beyond weapon sights to include night vision goggles that allowed soldiers to navigate and operate without using their hands to hold a scope. These developments further eroded the traditional Vietnamese advantage in night operations. Lieutenant Thomas Norris, a Navy SEAL who conducted numerous nighttime operations in the Mekong Delta, recalled, "The night vision goggles changed everything for special operations. We could move through the jungle at close to normal walking speed, identify friend from foe at distance, and operate effectively in environments that had previously belonged exclusively to the enemy. It was a complete reversal of the established order." The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong continually adapted their tactics in response to American night vision capability. One of their most effective countermeasures was the increased use of tunnels and underground facilities that were impervious to night vision detection. The Cu Chi Tunnel complex near Saigon was expanded and reinforced during this period, allowing Vietnamese forces to move troops and supplies literally under the feet of American forces without detection, regardless of the time of day. Colonel Vo Nguyen Giap, the brilliant military strategist who had defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu and now commanded North Vietnamese forces against the Americans, recognized the strategic implications of the night vision technology. In a directive issued to field commanders in late 1968, he wrote, "The Americans have gained temporary advantage with this new technology. We must adapt our operations accordingly, but remember that no technological advantage is permanent. They have the technology, but we have time. We will study their devices, develop countermeasures, and, if necessary, acquire this technology for ourselves." Giap's prediction would prove prescient in later conflicts, but during the Vietnam War, night vision technology remained firmly in American hands. The Soviets, who supplied much of North Vietnam's military equipment, were still developing their own night vision capabilities and could not provide comparable technology to their Vietnamese allies. This technological gap forced Vietnamese forces to rely on their traditional strengths, intimate knowledge of the terrain, superior camouflage techniques, and extraordinary patience. A particularly effective Vietnamese adaptation was the deliberate targeting of American night vision equipment for capture. Specialized units were tasked with ambushing American patrols known to carry Starlight scopes, with the primary objective being the capture of the devices, rather than inflicting casualties. These efforts met with limited success. Between 1967 and 1971, approximately 30 Starlight scopes were captured by Vietnamese forces. While not enough to equip their own troops in meaningful numbers, these captured devices allowed Vietnamese technical experts to study the technology and develop more effective countermeasures. By 1970, the technology had become such an integral part of American operations that special training programs were established to teach soldiers how to maximize its effectiveness. The Night Operations Training Center at Bien Hoa provided 2-week courses in night vision technology, tactics, and maintenance. Graduates returned to their units as qualified night vision instructors, spreading expertise throughout the American forces in Vietnam. Master Sergeant Harold Templeton, one of the instructors at the training center, emphasized the tactical shift. We had to teach a whole new way of fighting. Night vision wasn't just about seeing in the dark. It was about moving differently, communicating differently, even thinking differently. We taught soldiers to maximize contrast by understanding how the technology actually worked. For instance, moving subjects are easier to detect than stationary ones. A person crossing a trail is more visible than someone standing still against a tree. These weren't just technical lessons. They were changing the fundamental nature of how we fought. The technology continued to evolve throughout the conflict. By 1971, third-generation devices began appearing in limited quantities, featuring significant improvements in image clarity, battery life, and durability. These advanced units were primarily allocated to Special Operations Forces conducting some of the war's most sensitive missions, including cross-border operations into Laos and Cambodia. Major David Tucker, who commanded a Studies and Observation Group (SOG) team operating along the Laotian border, described the advantage. With the improved night vision, we could observe North Vietnamese supply convoys moving down the Ho Chi Minh Trail from over a kilometer away. We could count trucks, identify cargo types, and direct airstrikes with pinpoint precision. On moonlit nights, the clarity was almost like watching television. It was surreal to sit in complete darkness, watching enemy activity through this green window, knowing they had no idea they were being observed. The significance of night vision technology extended beyond tactical advantages. It represented a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare itself, the beginning of a new era where technological superiority could overcome traditional advantages like numerical superiority or intimate terrain knowledge. In this sense, Vietnam served as the testing ground for concepts that would define warfare for decades to come: the technological battlefield, persistent surveillance, and the erosion of natural cover and concealment. Dr. Richard Stevens, a military historian who served as an intelligence officer in Vietnam, later wrote, "The introduction of night vision technology in Vietnam foreshadowed the future of warfare. For millennia, soldiers had been constrained by human biological limitations. We could only see so far, hear so much, move so quickly. Vietnam marked the beginning of the era where technology would systematically overcome these natural limitations. The soldier who could see in the dark in 1967 would become the soldier who could see through walls, around corners, and across continents in later decades. For the Vietnamese soldiers who experienced this technological revolution firsthand, the impact was both practical and profound. A North Vietnamese Army veteran identified only as Nguyen recalled decades later, "When the Americans first began seeing at night, we thought it was some kind of black magic. How else could they target our patrols in complete darkness?" Some men refused to move at night, believing American snipers could see the souls of Vietnamese soldiers. Our commanders had to work hard to maintain morale. They explained it was only technology, not spirits. But knowing it was technology didn't make you any less dead if you were caught in their sights. As 1971 approached, the night battlefield in Vietnam had been transformed. What had once been a sanctuary for Vietnamese forces had become a hunting ground for American technology. The tactical equation had been fundamentally rebalanced. Yet this technological advantage came during a period when American strategy in Vietnam was shifting toward Vietnamization, the gradual withdrawal of U.S. forces and transfer of combat responsibilities to the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN. This created a new challenge: how to transfer night vision capability to South Vietnamese forces who would continue the fight. The technology was still classified, expensive, and required significant training and maintenance support. American military advisors worked to establish night vision training programs for ARVN forces, but the transfer of the technology proved problematic. Cultural differences, language barriers, and technical limitations hampered the effective adoption of night vision tactics by South Vietnamese troops. Colonel Nguyen Van Hien, who commanded an ARVN Ranger battalion, highlighted these challenges. Our soldiers understood the value of the night vision equipment, but we faced many obstacles in using it effectively. We lacked the technical expertise to maintain the devices in field conditions. Batteries were chronically in short supply. And many of our officers, trained in conventional tactics, struggled to adapt their operations to maximize the technology's potential. It was like being given a powerful weapon without sufficient ammunition or training. The story of night vision technology in Vietnam is incomplete without acknowledging its limitations. Despite its revolutionary impact, the technology could not overcome the broader strategic challenges facing American forces. Night vision gave tactical advantages in specific engagements, but could not address the fundamental political and strategic dimensions of the conflict. The ability to see in darkness did not translate into the ability to distinguish friend from foe in a complex insurgency, nor did it solve the challenge of winning hearts and minds in a civil conflict with deep historical roots. As American involvement in Vietnam wound down in the early 1970s, night vision technology represented both the promise and the limitations of technological warfare. It had dramatically altered tactical engagements, saved countless American lives, and forever changed how military forces would operate in darkness. Yet, like so many technological advantages in Vietnam, it proved insufficient to determine the ultimate outcome of the conflict. The night belonged to American forces, but the war's conclusion would be determined by factors beyond the scope of even the most advanced Starlight device. The story of how this revolutionary technology shocked and transformed the battlefield was just beginning, however. The lessons learned in the jungles of Vietnam would inform the development of ever more sophisticated night vision systems. The eerie green glow that had terrified Vietnamese soldiers would become a standard tool of military forces worldwide, evolving into the advanced thermal imaging and digital night vision systems used in later conflicts from Desert Storm to Afghanistan. For the Vietnamese soldiers who first encountered this seemingly magical technology, however, the psychological impact was immediate and lasting. Their reaction, a mixture of superstitious fear and grudging respect, reflected the momentous nature of the change. The natural cycle of day and night, which had governed warfare since humans first took up arms against one another, had been fundamentally altered. Technology had conquered darkness itself. And as the sun set over the Vietnamese jungle, on yet another day of a long and bitter conflict, American soldiers prepared to continue the fight through the night hours, their strange, green glowing eyes searching the darkness for movement. Meanwhile, their Vietnamese opponents adapted, evolved, and endured, knowing that in warfare, as in nature, every advantage eventually meets its countermeasure. The night no longer belonged exclusively to either side. It had become yet another contested domain in a war that would continue to shape military technology and tactics for generations to come. As 1971 progressed, both sides in the conflict continued their technological cat-and-mouse game. American forces refined their night vision tactics, while Vietnamese units developed increasingly sophisticated countermeasures. One such countermeasure emerged from an unlikely source: natural vegetation. Vietnamese scouts discovered that certain jungle plants, particularly those with high water content in their leaves, appeared differently through night vision devices than surrounding foliage. By selectively clearing some vegetation and preserving these night vision resistant plants, they created pathways that were less visible to American observation. A captured North Vietnamese field manual recovered during an operation near the Cambodian border contained detailed instructions. When establishing infiltration routes, remove all vegetation except for banana plants, bamboo stands, and plants with thick, waxy leaves. These appear as dark masses when viewed through American night devices, providing better concealment than other jungle growth. This level of technical understanding demonstrated the Vietnamese forces' remarkable adaptability. The American response was equally innovative. Night vision technology evolved beyond simply amplifying visible light to detecting near-infrared radiation, which better penetrated fog, smoke, and certain types of vegetation. By late 1971, limited numbers of AN/PVS-3 night vision devices began appearing in Vietnam, featuring significantly improved performance in adverse conditions. These devices, while still technically image intensifiers rather than true thermal imagers, represented a significant advancement. Major William Eastwick, who tested the new equipment with a reconnaissance unit in Quang Tri Province, noted the difference was immediately apparent. Where the old starlight would be nearly useless in heavy rain or fog, the new devices could still detect movement at reasonable distances. More importantly, the countermeasures the enemy had developed for first-generation equipment were less effective against the new technology. It reset the tactical equation once again. This technological evolution extended to vehicle-mounted systems as well. The night observation device, long-range, no DLR, provided tanks and armored vehicles with night vision capability at ranges up to 1,200 meters. Attack helicopters received the Night Vision Sight System, NVSS, allowing for effective close air support missions in complete darkness. Even artillery observation became possible at night, with forward observers using night vision equipment to direct accurate fire on targets that would have been invisible just years earlier. Colonel Robert Kingston, commanding the 3rd Brigade, 9th Infantry Division operating in the Mekong Delta, implemented what became known as night hunter tactics, combining night vision equipment with highly mobile infantry transported by patrol boats. "We reversed the entire operational tempo of the brigade," Kingston explained in a post-deployment briefing. "We conducted major operations primarily at night, rested during daylight hours, and maintained a constant presence in areas the enemy had previously controlled after sunset. Within 3 months, enemy activity in our area of operations dropped by nearly 70%. The war's progression into neighboring Cambodia and Laos in 1970-71 created new applications for night vision technology. The jungle terrain in these areas was often even denser than in Vietnam, with fewer settlements and developed areas. This environment would have provided perfect concealment for North Vietnamese supply routes and base areas, but night vision equipment allowed American and South Vietnamese forces to detect activity that would have otherwise remained hidden. Operation Lam Son 7019, the 1971 South Vietnamese incursion into Laos, aimed at cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail, made extensive use of night vision equipment for reconnaissance and targeting. Though the operation ultimately proved unsuccessful, after-action reports indicated that night vision devices had provided valuable intelligence that would have been completely unobtainable through other means. Colonel Arthur Moreland, an American advisor to the ARVN forces, noted, "Without night vision, we would have been blind to enemy troop concentrations until they were already attacking. The technology didn't prevent the operation's failure, but it did prevent that failure from becoming a catastrophe." By 1972, as American combat forces continued their withdrawal from Vietnam, night vision technology had become thoroughly integrated into military operations. The U.S. had manufactured and deployed over 3,000 Starlight scopes and related devices to Vietnam, providing night vision capability to most combat units. Night operations, once avoided whenever possible, had become a standard and often preferred tactic for American forces. The transfer of this technology to South Vietnamese forces remained problematic, however. The expense, technical complexity, and security concerns surrounding night vision devices meant that they could not be provided in numbers comparable to what American units had enjoyed. While elite ARVN units like the Airborne Division and Ranger groups received substantial allocations, Most conventional South Vietnamese infantry battalions had only a handful of devices, enough for limited night observation, but insufficient for the kind of comprehensive night operations American forces had conducted. This technological disparity became increasingly apparent during the 1972 Easter Offensive, when North Vietnamese forces launched a major conventional invasion across the DMZ and from sanctuaries in Cambodia and Laos. During the initial stages of the offensive, North Vietnamese forces specifically targeted South Vietnamese units during night hours, correctly assessing that their night vision capabilities were limited compared to American forces. The battle for Quang Tri City illustrated this dynamic. Lieutenant Tran Van Noot, commanding an ARVN infantry company, described the disadvantage. We had only 2 night vision devices for the entire company. The enemy attacked just after midnight in a heavy rainstorm. Our observation posts with night vision detected them at about 300 meters, but most of our perimeter was blind until the enemy was almost upon us. The difference between our capability and what the Americans had previously deployed in the same area was the difference between life and death. American advisors working with ARVN forces recognized this vulnerability and implemented emergency training programs focused on maximizing the effectiveness of the limited night vision equipment available. Technical Sergeant James Wilson, who conducted such training near Hue, recalled, "We taught them to use the available devices for early warning rather than attempting comprehensive surveillance. We developed rotation schedules to ensure the equipment was constantly monitoring the most likely avenues of approach and trained reaction forces to respond quickly to any detection. It wasn't ideal, but it helped compensate for the numerical shortage." The technological gap extended to maintenance capability as well. The humid Vietnamese environment was particularly hard on the sensitive electronics in night vision devices. American forces had established specialized maintenance facilities and supply chains for replacement parts and batteries. As these resources diminished with the American withdrawal, South Vietnamese units struggled to keep their limited night vision equipment operational. Major Nguyen Van Kien, responsible for equipment maintenance for an ARVN division, highlighted these challenges. The batteries alone were a constant problem. Each Starlight scope required specific batteries that were not interchangeable with other equipment. When the American supply system was fully operational, this was manageable. As they withdrew, we often had working scopes sitting unused because we lacked batteries. We attempted to modify vehicle batteries for temporary use, but this often damaged the sensitive electronics. Despite these challenges, night vision technology remained a critical capability, particularly for specialized South Vietnamese units conducting reconnaissance and counterinsurgency operations. The South Vietnamese Marine Corps, which had worked closely with American advisors to develop night combat doctrine, continued to conduct effective night operations throughout 1972 and 1973, often targeting North Vietnamese logistics routes. Captain Nguyen Thanh Tri, who commanded a South Vietnamese Marine Reconnaissance Company, described their operations. "We adapted American techniques to our own capabilities. We couldn't match their technological density, having night vision for every squad, but we developed tactics that maximized our limited equipment. We used night vision for initial targeting and route planning, then relied on specially trained point men who could move effectively in darkness with minimal technological assistance. It wasn't perfect, but it allowed us to maintain some presence in what had once again become contested night terrain." Meanwhile, North Vietnamese forces continued to refine their countermeasures against night vision technology. By 1972, they had incorporated lessons learned from 5 years of experience against these devices. Their adaptations ranged from the tactical to the technical. Tactically, they adjusted their movement patterns to take advantage of known limitations in the technology. Technically, they developed more sophisticated camouflage specifically designed to defeat night vision observation. A particularly effective North Vietnamese tactic was the use of light discipline taken to extreme levels. Recognizing that night vision devices amplified available light, they eliminated even the smallest light sources during movements. Cigarettes were absolutely forbidden. Cooking fires were only permitted under triple canopied jungle and carefully shielded. Vehicle headlights were reduced to tiny slits of light, visible only from directly in front and at short ranges. Even the moonlight reflection from metal surfaces was addressed. Weapons and equipment were wrapped in cloth or covered with non-reflective materials. Lieutenant Colonel Tran Thanh Minh, who commanded North Vietnamese forces in Thua Thien Province, later described these adaptations. "We studied the American technology and understood its principles. Light amplification requires some light to amplify. If we could reduce our light signature to near zero, we could still move effectively at night. Our soldiers trained to navigate using only touch and their knowledge of terrain. We moved more slowly, but we moved undetected. The Americans had superior technology, but we had superior patience." This patient adaptation characterized North Vietnamese responses throughout the conflict. Rather than attempting to match American technological capabilities, an impossibility given their industrial and economic limitations, they developed asymmetric counters that exploited the technology's weaknesses while maximizing their own traditional strengths. One such asymmetric response was the increased use of tunnels and underground facilities. The already extensive tunnel networks were expanded and deepened, often reaching depths that completely defeated surface observation regardless of the technology employed. The North Vietnamese correctly assessed that American night vision equipment could not see through solid earth, and underground movement became increasingly important to their logistics system. Colonel William Smith, an intelligence officer with the 25th Infantry Division, acknowledged this adaptation. "As our night vision capability improved, more and more enemy activity went underground. In 1967, we detect significant night movement on the surface. By 1970, such movement had decreased dramatically, not because the enemy had reduced operations, but because they'd literally taken them underground. The tunnels were beyond the reach of our night vision technology. It was a logical adaptation we should have anticipated sooner. The ongoing dialectic between technological advantage and adaptive countermeasure represented the essence of modern warfare. Each advance was met with a counter. Each counter eventually required a new advance. This cycle drove the rapid evolution of night vision technology throughout the conflict, from the first-generation Starlight scopes to increasingly sophisticated systems. By 1973, as American involvement in the war drew to a close with the signing of the Paris Peace Accords, night vision technology had evolved through nearly 3 generations. The latest devices featured significantly improved resolution, better performance in adverse weather, reduced weight, and extended battery life. However, the majority of these advanced systems never saw deployment to Vietnam, as they entered production just as American forces were completing their withdrawal. For Vietnamese forces on both sides, the American departure created a new equilibrium. The technological advantage that had briefly given American forces dominance of the night battlefield diminished as night vision devices became increasingly scarce and difficult to maintain. The natural cycle of night and day began to reassert its influence on military operations. In a sense, the Vietnamese night was returning to its traditional owners. Captain David Anderson, one of the last American advisors to South Vietnamese forces, observed this transition. "As we withdrew, you could see the operational patterns shifting back. ARVN units became more reluctant to conduct night operations. NVA forces became more aggressive after dark. The technological bubble that had temporarily altered the fundamental nature of the conflict was collapsing. The night was reverting to the side that understood it best without technological assistance. The North Vietnamese offensive of 1975, which ultimately led to the fall of Saigon and the end of the Vietnam War, featured extensive night operations by communist forces. By this time, South Vietnamese night vision capabilities had degraded significantly due to equipment failures, battery shortages, and the absence of American technical support. North Vietnamese commanders, recognizing this vulnerability, specifically targeted night hours for major movements and attacks. General Van Tien Dung, who commanded the final offensive, noted in his memoirs, "We had learned to respect American night vision technology, but by 1975, this advantage had largely disappeared. Our forces could once again use darkness as our ally, moving divisions under the cover of night with minimal detection." The Americans had temporarily changed the rules of warfare with their technology, but without their direct involvement, the natural order reasserted itself. The legacy of night vision technology in Vietnam extended far beyond the conflict itself. The lessons learned, both technical and tactical, informed the development of military technology for decades to come. First and foremost was the recognition that technological advantage is often temporary. The Vietnamese adaptation to night vision technology demonstrated that even the most revolutionary military innovations eventually encounter effective countermeasures. This lesson would be repeatedly relearned in later conflicts from Afghanistan to Iraq. Major General William Dupuy, who commanded the 1st Infantry Division in Vietnam before becoming one of the Army's leading doctrinal thinkers, observed, "Vietnam taught us that technology creates windows of opportunity, not permanent advantages. The night vision revolution gave us perhaps 2 years of significant tactical advantage before the enemy developed effective counters." The lesson isn't that technology doesn't matter, it matters enormously, but that you must exploit technological advantages quickly and decisively before they erode. This concept of technological half-life became a fundamental consideration in later military planning. Rather than assuming that any technological advantage would be permanent, military doctrine evolved to emphasize rapid exploitation of temporary superiority, striking decisively during the window of advantage before countermeasures could be developed and deployed. Dr. Weiss Balsuri, Thomas Monken, a military historian who studied the technological aspects of the Vietnam War, explained, "The night vision experience in Vietnam was a perfect case study in the temporary nature of military technical advantage. Initially, it completely upset the tactical balance. The Vietnamese went from owning the night to being severely disadvantaged. But through adaptation, improvisation, and tactical flexibility, they gradually eroded that advantage. By the war's end, they had developed a sophisticated suite of countermeasures that substantially neutralized the technology's impact. This pattern, revolutionary technology, followed by gradual adaptation, has repeated in virtually every conflict since. The technical evolution of night vision devices continued at an accelerated pace after Vietnam. The first-generation passive systems used in the conflict were superseded by increasingly sophisticated technologies. Second-generation devices featuring improved light amplification through micro-channel plates began widespread deployment in the 1970s. Third-generation systems, incorporating gallium arsenide photocathodes and ion barrier films, emerged in the 1980s, providing dramatically improved performance. Perhaps most significantly, thermal imaging technology, which detects heat signatures rather than amplifying visible light, matured into practical military systems in the post-Vietnam era. Unlike image intensification devices, thermal imagers require no ambient light whatsoever and can detect targets through smoke, light fog, and camouflage. This technology addressed many of the countermeasures that had proven effective against the Vietnam-era night vision devices. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Gabriel, who studied the technological aspects of the Vietnam War as part of the Army's Lessons Learned program, noted, "The Vietnamese tactics of extreme light discipline and specialized camouflage were effective against image intensification technology, but they would have been largely useless against modern thermal imaging systems, which don't rely on visible light at all." The technological trajectory that began in Vietnam, with the Starlight scope, led directly to the thermal systems that proved so decisive in later conflicts. This evolution reached a dramatic culmination during Operation Desert Storm in 1991, where American forces equipped with advanced night vision and thermal imaging systems demonstrated overwhelming superiority in night combat against Iraqi forces. The left hook maneuver that outflanked Iraqi defenses was conducted largely during night hours, with American tanks and infantry fighting vehicles advancing rapidly through the desert darkness, while their Iraqi opponents remained effectively blind. General Norman Schwarzkopf, who commanded coalition forces during Desert Storm, explicitly acknowledged the Vietnam legacy. The night vision revolution that began in the jungles of Vietnam reached its full expression in the deserts of Iraq. We owned the night completely, and that ownership translated directly into saved lives and swift victory. The difference was that in Vietnam, the technology was new, limited in distribution, and facing an enemy skilled at jungle warfare. In Desert Storm, the technology had matured, was widely available throughout our forces, and we faced an enemy unprepared for night combat. The human dimension of the night vision revolution in Vietnam left equally important legacies. Veterans of the conflict, both American and Vietnamese, carried their experiences into civilian life and, in many cases, into future military operations. American veterans who had experienced the tactical advantage of night vision became advocates for continued development and deployment of the technology. Vietnamese veterans, conversely, carried their hard-won knowledge of countermeasures and adaptations. Staff Sergeant James Monroe, who had operated a Starlight scope as a sniper in Vietnam and later served as an instructor at the Army Sniper School, reflected on this human legacy. Those of us who had seen what night vision could do became its biggest proponents. When I was teaching snipers in the 1980s, I made sure every student understood not just how to use the technology, but why it mattered. I'd tell them stories from Vietnam, how the technology had saved lives, how it had changed the equation. Many of the senior officers who funded night vision development in the 1970s and 80s were Vietnam veterans who had seen its value firsthand. This advocacy extended beyond the military into law enforcement, where night vision technology began finding applications in the 1980s. SWAT teams and specialized police units adopted military-derived night vision equipment for hostage situations, surveillance operations, and high-risk warrants. The tactical lessons learned in Vietnam about observation patterns, equipment limitations, and effective employment transferred directly to these civilian applications. For Vietnamese veterans, particularly those who had faced American night vision technology and developed countermeasures, the legacy was more nuanced. Their experience demonstrated the importance of asymmetric responses to technological superiority, finding weaknesses in advanced systems and exploiting them through adaptation and innovation. This approach would influence insurgents and irregular forces in later conflicts who faced technologically superior opponents. Colonel Bui Tin, a North Vietnamese officer who was present at the fall of Saigon and later became a military historian, observed, "Perhaps the most important lesson we learned from confronting American night vision technology was psychological. Initially, our soldiers feared it as something supernatural. But as they developed effective countermeasures, they realized that even the most advanced technology has limitations and vulnerabilities." This understanding, that no technological advantage is absolute, became part of our military thinking. It gave our forces confidence when facing technologically superior opponents. The psychological impact of night vision technology extended to its effects on American service members as well. For many Vietnam veterans, the introduction of night vision devices marked a turning point in their war experience, the moment when the terrifying vulnerability of night operations transformed into a position of advantage. This psychological shift had profound effects on morale and combat effectiveness. Dr. Jonathan Shea, a psychiatrist who worked extensively with Vietnam veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, noted this dimension. Many veterans I treated identified night operations before night vision equipment as particularly traumatic. The sense of vulnerability, the fear of the unseen, the psychological pressure of knowing the enemy could see you when you couldn't see them. The introduction of night vision technology often appears in their narratives as a pivotal moment when some measure of control was restored. It didn't eliminate the trauma of combat, but it reduced one of its most psychologically damaging aspects, the helplessness of being unable to see your surroundings. The technological legacy of Vietnam-era night vision also included important lessons about the relationship between technology and terrain. The devices that performed effectively in Vietnam's jungles had different characteristics than those needed for desert, urban, or Arctic environments. Subsequent development of night vision systems specifically addressed these environmental variations, creating specialized devices for different operational contexts. Colonel Thomas Evans, who worked on night vision development at Fort Belvoir after serving in Vietnam, explained this evolution. Vietnam taught us that night vision technology isn't one size fits all. The jungle environment created specific challenges: high humidity, dense vegetation, limited ambient light under triple canopy. Later developments specifically addressed different operational environments, optimizing systems for particular terrains and climates. The experience in Vietnam provided the foundation for this environmental specialization. By the 1980s, night vision technology had become standard equipment for modern military forces worldwide. The Soviet Union, which had lagged behind American capabilities during the Vietnam era, developed their own sophisticated night vision systems. Other nations followed suit, either through indigenous development programs or by acquiring technology through military sales, or, in some cases, espionage. This proliferation meant that the absolute advantage American forces had enjoyed in Vietnam would not be replicated in future conflicts. While the United States maintained a qualitative edge in night vision technology, the mere possession of such capability was no longer unique. Future conflicts would feature adversaries with at least some night vision capability, creating a more complex tactical environment. General Wesley Clark, who commanded NATO forces during operations in Kosovo, noted this changed reality. By the 1990s, night vision had gone from being a revolutionary advantage to being a requirement for modern military operations. The absolute advantage American forces had briefly enjoyed in Vietnam evolved into a relative advantage based on superior technology, more complete distribution, better training, and more effective tactical employment. But our opponents were no longer completely blind at night, as the Vietnamese had initially been. The legacy of Vietnam-era night vision also included important lessons about the integration of new technology into existing military organizations and doctrine. The initial deployment of Starlight scopes occurred without comprehensive tactical doctrine or training programs. Units received the equipment and largely developed their own procedures for employment, leading to inconsistent results and missed opportunities. As night vision technology matured in subsequent decades, the process of technological integration became more systematic. New equipment was deployed with established doctrine, comprehensive training programs, and clear maintenance protocols. The ad hoc approach of the Vietnam era evolved into a sophisticated process for fielding new capabilities. Lieutenant General William Odom, who served as an intelligence officer in Vietnam before becoming director of the National Security Agency, reflected on this evolution. In Vietnam, we essentially threw new technology into the field and expected units to figure out how to use it effectively. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. The night vision experience taught us the importance of systematic integration, developing doctrine concurrently with technology, establishing training programs before deployment, and creating the logistical infrastructure to sustain new capabilities. This lesson transformed how the military adopted new technologies in subsequent decades. For Vietnamese soldiers who had faced American night vision technology, the experience left lasting impressions that influenced their views on military technology and American power. Many described their initial encounters with night vision devices in almost supernatural terms. invisible enemies who could somehow see in complete darkness, striking with uncanny precision. Nguyen Van Dao, who served as a Viet Cong guerrilla in the Mekong Delta, recalled, "The first time we encountered this technology, it seemed like magic. Men would be shot with perfect accuracy on the darkest nights. We believed the Americans had special powers or were using some kind of magic. Even after our commanders explained the technology, it remained frightening. You never knew when you were being watched through those green eyes." It changed how we thought about night operations. Something that had always been our advantage suddenly became dangerous. As American combat forces withdrew from Vietnam and the technology became less prevalent, many Vietnamese veterans described a sense of restored balance, a return to the natural order where those with the greatest knowledge of the terrain held the advantage, regardless of technological disparities. Tran Minh Tam, who served with North Vietnamese regular forces, expressed this sentiment. "When the Americans were present with their night devices, we felt hunted. The darkness was no longer our ally. After they left, that pressure lifted. We could move more freely again, using our knowledge of the land rather than having to counter their technology." It was like the jungle itself had been temporarily conquered by American science, but then returned to its natural state. This perception of temporary technological dominance, followed by a return to more fundamental advantages, reflected a broader pattern in the Vietnam conflict, and indeed in many asymmetric conflicts throughout history. Technological superiority created significant tactical advantages, but proved insufficient to determine strategic outcomes when confronted with an adversary with superior local knowledge, greater strategic patience, and a higher tolerance for casualties. Colonel Harry Summers, a Vietnam veteran who became one of the Army's leading strategic thinkers, captured this dynamic in a famous exchange he reportedly had with a North Vietnamese colonel after the war. When Summers asserted, "You know, you never defeated us on the battlefield," the North Vietnamese officer replied, "That may be so, but it is also irrelevant." The technological advantages that provided tactical superiority, including night vision dominance, ultimately proved insufficient to secure strategic victory. As the Vietnam War receded into history, the night vision technology that had so shocked Vietnamese soldiers evolved into an expected component of modern warfare. The revolutionary became conventional. What had once seemed like magic became standard equipment. Yet the fundamental lesson remained valid. Technological advantage, while powerful, is always temporary and incomplete. The side that adapts more effectively, integrates technology more thoroughly into its operations, and maintains its core strengths, even while countering enemy advantages, often prevails in the long term. For military planners and technologists, the Vietnam night vision experience provided a compelling case study in both the power and limitations of technological superiority in warfare. It demonstrated how revolutionary technology could dramatically alter tactical dynamics while simultaneously showing how human adaptation and ingenuity could counter even the most advanced systems. Dr. James Wilbanks, a military historian who served as an advisor to ARVN forces during the 1972 Easter Offensive, summarized this dual legacy. The night vision revolution in Vietnam demonstrated both the tremendous potential of technology to change warfare and the remarkable human capacity to adapt to such changes. The technology initially shocked Vietnamese forces and created a significant tactical advantage for American units. But over time, through careful observation and innovative countermeasures, that advantage eroded. The cycle of measure and countermeasure, technology and adaptation continues to define modern warfare, with the Vietnam experience serving as a formative case study. Today, night vision technology has evolved far beyond the rudimentary starlight scopes that first appeared in Vietnam jungles. Modern systems combine image intensification with thermal imaging, digital enhancement, and networked capabilities that allow for information sharing across platforms. What began as a revolutionary but limited technology has become an integrated component of comprehensive battlefield awareness systems. Yet for the Vietnamese soldiers who first encountered this technology, who saw their traditional advantage suddenly neutralized by green glowing eyes in the darkness, the impact was profound and lasting. Their initial shock, followed by careful adaptation and eventual countermeasures, exemplified the eternal cycle of warfare: innovation, surprise, adaptation, and counter-innovation. The night would never again belong exclusively to those who knew the terrain best. Technology had permanently altered the equation, but neither would technology alone determine who controlled the darkness. The human element, training, tactics, discipline, and creativity remained decisive. In the end, the story of night vision technology in Vietnam represents more than just a military innovation. It marks a fundamental shift in the relationship between humans and warfare, a moment when technology began to systematically overcome natural limitations that had constrained military operations since the dawn of human conflict. The boundary that had always existed between day and night, between visibility and concealment, became permeable. This transformation, which continues with technologies like thermal imaging, radar, and networked sensors, began with those first starlight scopes and the shocked Vietnamese soldiers who suddenly found themselves visible in what had always been protective darkness.